Welcome to our program on investment and trade in China and Asia, evolving opportunities and challenges. China remains in the headlines as businesses and policymakers assess how to navigate what's happening on the ground there and in Congress here. We have a wonderful group of speakers with us now. Tim Stratford is Senior Counsel in Covington and Burling's Beijing office, and he's in Beijing now. Dan Wang is the Chief Economist at Hang Seng Bank China. She's traveling in Hong Kong and is based in Shanghai. And moderating today is Guonan Ma, a Senior Fellow at the Chinese Economy at the Asia Society Policy Institute Centers for China Analysis. And he's joining us from New York City. All of our speaker bios are on our website in full. And I'd like to welcome our members in Seattle and Northern California. We're also pleased to have many of you joining us from other parts of the country and the globe as well. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of our Northern California and Seattle centers. I'm here with our team, including our Program Director, Man Wang in Seattle, who curated this event today. For our format, you're going to hear remarks from each of our speakers, and then Guonan is going to moderate a discussion with our speakers. There will be an opportunity for audience Q&A, so please type your questions in the Q&A box. You can get those going at any time now. This is on the record. We are recording, and the video will be posted on our website. We have an hour for this discussion. We'll end at 6 p.m. Pacific. That's 9 a.m. in Beijing. Thank you, speakers, very much for doing this. And let's go ahead and get going with Guonan.
Thank you, Margaret. As we all know, intensified geopolitics has become a key feature of today's world, especially for those of us who are continuing engaging in and caring about cross-border trade and investment. Geopolitics also tends to interact and amplify local politics, trade tension, and domestic economic challenge, adding risk to those firms and individuals doing cross-border business. How we are going to prepare, navigate, and cope with the challenge of this new world? To shed light on these important questions and many others, we are fortunate to have two well-informed experts on today's panel, hosted by the Asia Society. And the plan will be the following. First, we will ask our two guest speakers to briefly give an opening remarks. And then I will follow up with a few questions to discuss with the two panelists. And finally, we open the floor for the audience for comments and questions. Okay, we'll turn to Dan first. Dan, you have the floor.
So it's my great honor to share with you my understanding of what's going on in China and the changing environment of doing business in China. What has changed in China in the past 3 years is quite striking. It is not only that China seems to be stuck in a low inflation environment, but also it seems that many more foreign investors have deemed China as uninvestable. Based in Shanghai myself, I can see the changing attitudes and the lack of policy response from the Chinese government. There are a lot of discussion about why China is in where it is now. It could have a lot to do with the changing leadership, because the new leadership is a lot more conservative than the older one. And what they're focusing on now is the security issues. And it's not just the supply chain security, but also energy security, food security. And that means the resources have been directed from the soft attack from the consumer market to the industrial sectors and to especially the high-tech sectors. And the implication of that changing attitude is quite significant, because in the 30 years before COVID, basically the market-based economy and reforms were the main theme. But now with a heightened alerted sense that China might face more sanctions and more restrictions from both the US and maybe the European market, There have been an effort of China's collaborative intentions with the global South instead of with the developed nations. And for domestic economy, we can see that the biggest problem has been the housing market. And the housing crisis is not an organic problem with China's business cycle. Rather, it is an intentional change. From 2021, the Chinese government has been trying to squeeze the asset bubble and also to tell the real estate developers to deal with the debt problem. But as a result, it has dried up the liquidity in not just the housing sector, but also in the greater economy. And even now, we don't see any sign of the housing market turning around. So our forecast right now is that the housing market might have a reverse or a changed or a warmed up attitude towards the end of 2025. But before that, we probably will see more of a falling trend. The sales have been going down as well as the home prices. And on a greater scale of the domestic economy, the manufacturing industry and infrastructure spending are still holding up quite well. But besides that, the consumer sentiment is still quite muted. Income growth and wage growth have slowed, and people have become way more conservative. And we see higher propensity to save and a lack of interest in the stock market. So I will stop here and we'll come back with some of the questions that you're interested.
Thank you, Dan. Next, let's turn to Tim for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be on this panel with you, Guanan, and with Danwan. My main focus over the last few years has been trying to address the fundamental uncertainty that the business community feels, both the domestic business community, but especially the foreign business community in China. So I go to DC, I meet with officials there, then I come here to Beijing, I meet with officials here, and I try to understand what's going on. So if you talk about uncertainty as maybe the central sentiment of foreign investors, we've just heard Danwang talk about the economic uncertainty, and one wonders, will there be enough economic growth to justify new investments? Is this a market that people should be focused on? And I think for many people, it depends on what industry you're in, because some industries will have far better prospects than others. So I think we have to take a nuanced look and say, what kinds of economic opportunities are there? But let me focus for a minute on the geopolitical uncertainties. I think for the last several years, we've observed that U.S.-China relations have been deteriorating. They've been deteriorating on a slow basis. They haven't just fallen off a cliff, but each side does things that the other side doesn't like, and so they respond accordingly, and then you respond to what they've done, and so you have a decline. But the decline's been gradual because each side recognizes that if there's a serious, steep decline, it's very bad for everyone. So what we've been trying to do is slow down the decline so that somehow, despite fundamental strong disagreements between the two countries, they still can manage their differences in a way so that the relationship doesn't continue to become fundamentally worse. And I think that's what we've seen now. Both sides have had a strong interest in having a more stable relationship, but they haven't been willing to give up their core concerns about what the other government's doing. So basically, we have a two-level problem. One is, can we solve the deeper fundamental questions? And I think most people think that those questions are not going to be resolved anytime soon. They're going to be with us for at least a decade. And we're going to have to figure out how to live with those differences. So then on the second level, the question is, can we maintain a kind of stability in the relationship even while we're trying to deal with these deeper problems with South China Sea, with Taiwan, with different economic models, with how we're dealing with Ukraine and Russia, all of these different types of issues. And I think what you've seen, the US government sent a series of cabinet members here. And of course, most recently, just earlier this week, Secretary Yellen was here. And I think the actual tone of those meetings has been quite professional and quite constructive. And so you can see that both sides are trying to get along with each other, but at the same time, they can't really make a lot of progress on the deeper issues. I was meeting with a senior party official yesterday, and she described the situation as a kind of dynamic stability. So the question is, I love the phrase. So the question is, how fragile is this dynamic stability while we're learning to do as much business and cooperate as much as we can in important areas, while at the same time, we really have fundamental differences of opinion that are core concerns of each country. So I think that's where we are now. We're in a kind of a fragile, dynamic stability. I think both sides don't want things to fall off a cliff between now and the presidential election. China doesn't want to be part of the negative election rhetoric that we get in the United States around this time of year. But at the same time, we have concerns about what's going on in the Philippines. We have concerns in other areas, and we have economic concerns. We have technology transfer concerns. So this is where we are right now, in a fragile period of improved stability, but we have to see how long will that last. If you're a business person and you feel like you need to invest another $2 billion to build a plant to stay competitive in this highly competitive market, you want to know that there's going to be a stable, predictable period for you to get a return on your investment for your particular industry and your particular role in the value chain. So that's kind of a general description of where I think we are right now.
Tim, may I follow up with one or two questions, maybe with both you and Dan? I clearly see both sides in Beijing and Washington have tried their best to manage this very fragile situation. This can be seen, for example, from the recent meeting of Xi Jinping with the American CEOs in Beijing, and Janet Yellen visit to China. So it's besides one thing, can they manage to do so sensibly in the next year or so, just getting through the US elections first? Either Dan or Tim, you can take up the question.
Well, I can maybe comment. It will not be easy. The Chinese government's not pleased at the meetings that are taking place in Washington right now with the US, the Philippines, and Japan. There hasn't been a let-up of pressure. When we have competition points, each side is pushing against the other, and we're not really seeing a let-up of that. I think we can see, I would expect that we're going to see more action by the US government expressing their concern about the type of economic support that a number of Chinese companies have been giving to the Russian economy that's affecting the military. That's an area where I expect that we'll see the US pushing harder because they're not happy with what China's doing. And I think we can see another of pressure areas. So it's going to be difficult. I think that the leaders of both countries recognize that they can't push too far. And China has shown some constraint on the economic side in retaliating for what they see as unfair measures where the US is trying to control some sensitive technologies. So I think it's doable, but I think we continue to have to watch it very carefully because it is very fragile. That's my view.
Hi, Dan, what would you take?
Of course, keeping the conversation going is quite important. But just look at the reaction from the recent visit of Yellen. She's been talking about overcapacity and gave some advice to China's industries, like Chinese should increase their wage payment, for its workers, and better environmental protection measures and things like that. It is not received very well. Because for a simple reason, the overcapacity issue in China doesn't just happen in the traditional industries, but also in the green industries. For the emerging industries like the battery, solar panel, EVs, they are the ones that China actually enjoy advantage. But the development of those areas actually depends on the openness of the global market to China. The American market is basically closed, and it doesn't look like, based on the tone of Yellen, they're not going to open that market to China. Maybe there's a way for Chinese companies to directly invest in the greenfield, in terms of greenfield investment in America, but it's going to be quite costly. Otherwise, it just has to relocate some of the supply chain away from China, and it's not favorable to Chinese government or to Chinese industries. It's extremely costly to set up overseas plants. And for the other issues regarding increasing the labor welfare or the social welfare in general, it is a key issue. But in the past few years, we can see the increased attention in China's job market. It's not just the youth unemployment, but the general job market is under pressure. Although it's not difficult to find a job in China, the average wage and income growth have been going down. So given that, I just don't think China can have actually an effective response to Yellen's request. And the tension between China and the US would only increase, in my opinion, in the coming months.
I agree with that.
Okay.
I think that, as I said, the fundamental problems, neither side is in a position to yield very much. So the question is, how much can they keep that dispute going, but not have the reaction and the counter reaction move us again to a more rapid downward spiral? And so that's really what we all have to keep our eyes on.
I probably agree with both of your comments here, in the sense that probably China at the moment faces a unemployment problem, and it's not the best time to raise wage, to say the least. And I hope Dan and them will agree with me on this point. Of course, people can always agree to disagree, but the important thing is not to do things drastically worsen the situation. I have one question for Dan regarding the recent decline in the foreign investment into China. What will be your take? What are the main reasons behind this recent remarkable decline in the foreign investment into China?
There are several factors. One that is highly visible is the difference in the return in investment, because now the risk-free return in most assets in China is close to zero, but the risk-free return in the US, for example, is close to 5%. And that is a huge difference, even for some of the investors that have confidence in China's long-term growth. In the short term, to park their money outside of China seem to be a better choice. And there are a lot of uncertainties in Chinese economy when it comes to how to deal with the housing market, how to reverse the business sentiment. So it is quite rational for anyone in their right mind to wait and see what's going on before they decide to move more money into China. But another reason for the real economy, the investment in industries, I think the fundamental problem is not that China has lost its advantage in manufacturing, or it's no longer the best place to produce things in the world, but it's the local competition. So when I talk to the foreign business operating in China, they would be concerned about China-US relations and all other things. But if you push them hard enough to ask them what's the biggest problem, it is always end up with one thing, and that's local competition. For a lot of the mid and upstream supply chain, the major players, they have been facing this issue of a thinner profit over the years because their domestic counterparts have become so competitive. Part of it may be because of the government subsidies, but it's, in my opinion, is only half of the equation, and in many cases, even less half of the equation. And Chinese business have figured out a way to organize their production in a more efficient way for many of those manufacturing sectors. And as a result, they can replace a lot of the foreign market share. And over the years, it has become this new reality that Chinese assets probably won't be more efficiently operated under the foreign investors' hands. So it's basically a problem of ownership of the assets. So it used to be the case that foreigners manage those assets more efficiently, and China welcome more of the foreign investment, and they can make more profit as well. But over the years, the situation has changed. The master producers are more efficient, and they have been learning quite quickly. So I think that's probably one of the problems that a lot of foreign investors still need to keep some of their business in China in order to stay competitive in that industry, but they cannot make profit or be competitive enough against their Chinese counterparts.
If I could just add, I agree completely with what Dan has just said. The local Chinese competitors are very competent, and it's very difficult for foreign companies in many cases to keep up with them. If you look at the electric vehicle industry, for example, not only in the China market but globally, the leaders of major global car manufacturers have said that they're several years behind China in doing this, and so you have to give the Chinese entrepreneurs a lot of credit for what they have achieved. At the same time, there's another dynamic as well, and that is that especially in sensitive technologies, but also largely across many spheres of the economy, the Chinese government wants to develop self-sufficiency so that Western powers such as the United States cannot exercise what they would regard as undue leverage. And so for sensitive technologies, there's a lot of emphasis on developing national champions. Chinese companies are told, buy from the Chinese company, and even though their product is not quite as good yet, you should still buy from them because we need to develop the Chinese industry in that sector. So, a number of years ago when I was working at General Motors and we were investing in China, we saw the China market as something that was going to grow indefinitely. And as long as we could maintain a share of that market, it would be a very attractive investment. But now in many sectors, the sense that as long as foreigners have something to contribute, they're welcome. But as soon as possible, Chinese companies will take more and more of that particular industry sector. And so companies have a less optimistic view about their future. And so the risk involved doesn't lead you to be as aggressive in investing in a market if you think the market for foreign companies is going to be diminishing over time. And again, this depends a lot on which industry you're in. In some cases, the more enthusiastic China is to welcome you in a particular sector now because they need you, they're also more keen to not need you in the future. And so it's kind of a two-edged sword.
It's kind of adverse dynamics here. So here we have a dilemma here. On the one hand, Beijing intends to rely less on the high-end technology from the US and try to pool resources to improve its own self-reliance, quote unquote, in particular technology segments. But on the other hand, we are also seeing fairly cutthroat competition locally in China, with or without government subsidy, as Dan mentioned earlier. Now, of these two very different dynamics here. Which one probably will, going forward, be more important? Government-led investment subsidy or local competition? And both probably will pose some risk to foreign investors.
Well, in terms of the drive for self-sufficiency, China's sense of urgency on that has depended a lot on what the U.S. government has done. It makes it hard for foreign companies to compete in China when the government in particular sectors is focused on self-sufficiency. But we have to understand that what the Chinese government's doing is not unreasonable, because if they see the U.S. government cutting off access to this technology, then of course it's only reasonable that China would try to do that. And so each government has their logic for doing what they're doing. It's just that we that are in the business community are stuck in the middle. And we need to try to figure out what is the space where both governments would welcome us to continue to compete in the China market. Because there's some things the U.S. doesn't want to do, but China wants us to do. There's some things that the U.S. would want us to do, but China's not so open to that. And so this is what we're trying to figure out in the private sector. And for Chinese companies, one of the reasons they're competitive is because the government creates very favorable conditions, but they're very good at taking advantage of those conditions. So I think it's sort of the two dynamics that you mentioned, I think, are both happening and mutually reinforcing. And so I think both of those are very important for foreign companies to understand and to incorporate in their own business planning for China.
Hi, Dan, do you have anything to add?
So the import substitution or the self-sufficiency in technology has become a main driver for China's growth. And I can see both the costs and benefits, because on the surface, it looks like a faster way to reach Chinese government goals. But it has created a lot of barriers when it comes to international collaboration in certain technologies, and it's not just in the chip industry. Lately, there are a lot of discussion about this magical year of 2027. Something might happen in 2027. We don't know what, but maybe the Chinese government has a plan. But we don't know exactly what's going on. But when we look at their industrial plan, one of them is a high emphasis on the self-sufficiency in China's state sector. So for the 97 China's centrally owned enterprises, they have to completely be self-sufficient. They have to change their digital system completely to the domestic suppliers. And right now they can still use Microsoft, for example, but by then they have to replace that with Chinese operating system like WPS or something else. And this would, after 2027, be extended to 8 other strategic industries, including education, healthcare, finance, etc. So the path seems quite clear that China doesn't want to depend on maybe the benevolence from America on its high tech. But for China to develop all those technologies is highly costly, and in some areas, basically impossible, because it's global supply chain, like chips. You can't just single-handedly invent everything on your own for every point of to develop those chips. But we should also notice that Chinese government's industrial policy have been very effective in the past 20 years when it comes to cultivating global champions. And we have seen the development in the solar industry, in the wind technology, and now for the EV supply chains. So that has created maybe in a way a more hostile international environment for China. The government has realized that, but at this point, there's very little they can do. Their effort to develop the industry has already caused a tremendous investment in certain areas, overinvestment, and they need to find a market. to digest all those capacities. So in the next few years, I think we will see more of effort of Chinese companies going out, of Chinese products going out, maybe to the global south, but more effort probably will be in the European market.
Okay. Then do you agree with the team? Do you agree with Dan?
I do. And so that again underscores the dilemma we have on many levels. If you're a US company and China says we want to be self-sufficient in these different sectors over time, but at the same time, they say, we welcome you, we have no limits, we're always welcome, we're becoming more and more open to foreign investment, it gives us a mixed signal. So we have to be, we have to go beyond the headlines and we have to do the analysis, okay, for this particular industry, what role can we play and how long will we be able to do that? I mean, my own personal view is that the economic relationship between our two countries is extremely important, and it's something that we should enhance as much as we can, not only because of the pure economic benefits of working together, but also because it adds stability to the overall relationship. It means that Chinese people and American people are sitting down and working together and solving problems and developing friendships. And I think that the more contact we can have between our two countries, the better off we are. We see, Xi Jinping's acknowledgement and emphasis of that when he talked about people-to-people exchanges, when he was in San Francisco, when he talked about having students go. And so I think everybody agrees that having more exchanges between the people of our two countries is important. And I think that business is one of the important ways. But again, in the business community, we're looking for more clarity about how do we take China's open door and their self-sufficiency drive and find the space in it that creates an opportunity for us.
Great. As an economist, I have a strong hunch or belief that China and US, the two economies, are highly complementary to each other. But the problem is that geopolitics can only widen the trust deficit. And you need trust to turn the complementary advantage into cooperation. And that's the reason I have a suspicion that lately I'm seeing widening fracturing of the two economies here, or two camps, one led by the US and the other led by China. I'm not so sure whether you agree with my suspicion or not.
Well, I used to be a U.S. trade official. I worked at USTR, and I was responsible for the U.S. trade negotiations with China. And during the period I was at USTR, there was still a pretty strong consensus that the principles laid out in the WTO were the right pathway, and that there would be a lot of advantage for China and the U.S. to follow the WTO rules and to develop our trade based on national treatment and most favored nation treatment and that type of thing. But I don't think that there's the same strong consensus about the value of globalization as there used to be. And if you think about it, in order for globalization to bring about the benefits that the economists promise us that we will get, there's certain conditions that have to exist. And if these conditions don't exist, then globalization doesn't work. And so what are those conditions? Well, one of them is you've got to have rules that countries follow that allow the trade to take place on a fair basis. So if you block products from another country to protect your own producers, or if you subsidize your own producers or do some of these types of things, then globalization doesn't work because one country takes advantage of another country. So you've got to have rules. And the rules have to be adequate to the job. The second thing is you have to have an adequate enforcement mechanism so that if one country is not following the rules, you can address the problem quickly so that you don't create so much damage that late enforcement is too late. So you've got to have enforcement. The third thing, you've got to have domestic support in your own country to maintain and follow these rules. If parts of your country feel like they're being seriously disadvantaged, then the political leaders won't be able to continue to follow the rules. And that's something that we've seen in the United States and we've seen in another country, that some people feel that globalization hasn't worked for them. And part of this is a matter of whether you're enforcing the rules and living by the rules. And part of it is whether the country has an equitable way to allocate the benefits and the costs of further opening to the outside world. And so we've had problems in that area. A fourth area would have to do with national security. It used to be that in the United States, we dealt with national security by having a narrow range of products and technologies that were subject to export controls, but the most of trade would still be able to go. But now you have so much technology, even in your smartphone, that has defensive vulnerabilities and offensive capabilities, that you have to be a lot more thoughtful about what kinds of technologies you would allow to go to a potential adversary without creating vulnerabilities for yourself or creating offensive capabilities for them. So that's much more difficult to deal with as well. And then we're also concerned about supply chain resilience, and you have to make sure that you take certain steps to protect your country, not only for geopolitical reasons, the conflicts we have in certain parts of the world, but also because of natural disasters and things like the pandemic. So these 5 conditions have to be present in order to be able to have the benefits of globalization. And I think every single one of those conditions is seriously challenged right now. And I think that in the United States, they're trying to figure out, how can we maintain the benefits of globalization, but take account of the current realities and not break the world into different fragments, as you express, going on. So I think we're trying to figure this out, and I don't think we have it figured out yet.
So Dan, can you show any thoughts in this regard?
One thing I want to add is this heightened sense of data security or data sovereignty. Because for globalization to work, we need to have more of a free flow of capital, labor, and goods. But we're not producing and selling socks. We're not talking about selling socks and toys anymore. We're selling and producing things that deals with the consumer or the business data. For every major country in the world, there's a tremendous effort to invest to develop their own indigenous technology, especially in the AI front. China is like that. Most of the Middle Eastern countries are like that. American, European countries, everyone. And that has created this, in a way, a perfect competition in this market, which is good, but also a lot of wasteful investment. And probably this technology would have developed much faster if there was a collaboration, like the last round of internet development in late 1980s. But now that world has gone. What's happening in China now is that China is not only trying to develop its own technology and replace the foreign ones, but also it wants to dominate certain technology globally. It has some success, but to really go forward, it just cannot get around without a collaborative efforts between scientists and business communities in different countries. And on top of that, I can see that China has been the biggest actually beneficiaries from the globalization in the last round. But this round, it seems that there is an argument to be made that certain industries have to be protected. Even for the latest development in China's consumer technology related with mobile payment, or several of its best companies like Tencent, Alibaba, they benefited from China's own protection for its domestic industries. The European market was quite open in that front, and as a result, it didn't really get ahead in the latest digital transformation. So China needs a platform to develop its basic scientific research. And that means probably we'll see industrial policies to last a lot longer and maybe even more protective efforts to its domestic companies.
Okay, yeah. The important thing, the importance of globalization and cooperation, it's at stake here, because otherwise the fracturing, if continue long-lasting and widening, may turn the world upside down in the sense that from an initial vision of what's the word, small yard and high fences,
yeah,
into a widening national park and multiple national parks with shifting cliffs. I'm a bit worried about the widening of that small yard, and when things can continue in that direction. And that's one. In that regard, I have one more question for the two excellent speakers with regard to the TikTok controversy at the moment. We know the U.S. Congress passed some legislature, and we also know that in the past, for a long time, China has banned Google, and all these things help fracturing or fragmenting the economy we are having at the moment, the market we are having. And any thoughts from both of you?
Go ahead, Dan. I'd hear your thoughts first.
TikTok. Well, I actually think it's not a bad thing for TikTok to go through this scrutiny in the US. It will set an example for other Chinese companies that want to get into the US market. The legal cost is certainly high, but it's a necessary cost that every company should be prepared for. And I do think even for TikTok, a company like that to exist in the US, it's somewhat not a miracle-ish, but close to that, given how sensitive it is to deal with so much of the consumer data, and also have a political influence in a country that is in a lot of conflict with China. So I don't think it's going to be an easy battle, but also I think it's one of the examples to show how a company can survive in an environment like this. And it's not just TikTok, right? The top 5 apps that's downloaded in the US, 4 of them are from China, and 3 of them are related with e-business and what's the category of TikTok? The social media. And one of them is the short video, the real short. So that has a wider impact in the minority groups in the US. So it's not entirely impossible for the Chinese investment in the US. I think that is actually one of the positive sides from this recent development.
I agree with that. I think each government has a responsibility to identify risks that the country faces and to take reasonable measures to address those risks. I mean, it's taken some, the US has been advocating this, and it's been taking some time for the Chinese government to accept that way to frame things. But I think that the Chinese leadership has sort of come around, because after all, a lot of the things that China is doing that foreign companies don't like is China's efforts to de-risk. They're identifying things that they think are a risk to China, to the party, and so on. And so they're trying to take those measures. So again, coming back to my mantra that we want to have as much space for business as is reasonable, I think we need to perfect our ability to identify risks and to take measures that address that risk, but that don't go beyond that. And I think you have to be a technical expert to say, okay, is there any way that, what are the risks that you see with TikTok? Or what do you risks to see with Chinese EVs in the United States? Or what are the risks you see in these other areas? And is there a satisfactory way to address those risks so that you should be able to allow that kind of business activity to continue? It would be nice if Google and some of the American platforms were able to operate more freely in China too, but the China sees a risk there. So I think that China has taken a stronger measure than might be reasonably necessary to address the risk. And it'd be nice if they define some space that American companies could operate. And I think that it would be reasonable for the US to, articulate what the risk is and come up with effective measures for that as well.
I think, thank you very much for the two excellent panelists. And now we will leave some time for the audience to raise their questions and offer their comments. Okay, let's see. So one question the audience raises about the China's support of Russia in the Ukraine war, and would that cross the red line akin to Taiwan?
Yeah, I can say that as I've talked to U.S. officials while I've been visiting or in Beijing this week, this is something that U.S. officials particularly pointed out to me. They said that the U.S. believes that China has provided more economic support for for Russia that is beneficial to Russia's army. And so this is an issue that I think the U.S. is putting more and more focus on. And I do think we need to watch that very carefully to see how China responds to that. Well, I don't think that the Chinese side will be prepared to do anything differently than they are. I don't know, of course. But if they don't, I do think that we will see more sanctions from the U.S. government in this area. In my meetings with the Chinese Foreign Ministry over the past number of months, one of the things they've said to me is, we understand that the U.S. will be putting on sanctions and we do our things too. But a red line for us on the Chinese side is if the U.S. government goes after a major Chinese bank, we will find that unacceptable and we will have to take a strong response. So I don't know how the thinking has evolved, but if some of the U.S. actions go against Chinese banks and are crippling to the banks, and rather than very, very measured, I think that the Chinese side may respond rather strongly to that. And that may make it difficult for us to maintain this type of fragile dynamic stability that we've been discussing.
Okay, let's move on to the next question raised by the audience. Increasingly, we hear the discussion about China +1 strategy in terms of supply chain, and which in part relates to onshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, whatever. But with regard to Southeast Asia, investment as a destination, any of you have any thoughts on top of the China investment?
The China +1 strategy has been more mainstream now. And for multinationals to operate in Asia, usually they would want to have at least some assembly lines outside of China. Even if they're not under sanction now, people are preparing for further restrictions from the US, and that's a legit concern. And one thing I've noticed is that the narrative in the US and in China are very, very different. Because from the China side, the US totally succeeded in its restriction on China because more and more companies, including domestic companies, are trying to set up some of their plans overseas to cope with the potential sanction in the future. So that supply chain movement is quite obvious. But from the US side, their dependence in trade or in imports from China hasn't really decreased. Maybe the direct dependence decreased, but the indirect dependence doesn't. The third country trade is still going on. So neither side is happy about the end result. But the pain is quite visible in China. Even for the biggest Chinese companies, when they want to implement the China Plus One strategy, like setting up new factories in the Greater Asia, it has become more costly than before. Before 2022, it was relatively easy to buy land, set up companies, and employ local workers. But since then, the cost has been increasing quite rapidly. And from the beginning of this year, I've noticed a slowdown in this movement. Although Chinese government is encouraging more domestic companies actually to go out, invest further in overseas market, that pace has slowed. And for the US buyers, they have also felt the pain of having to pay more for the same goods, or sometimes they have to change their suppliers, and that's also very costly. So I think there would be a limit on how far this strategy can go. It's impossible to replace China with another country or even a combination of other countries, especially when a multinational is dealing with several Asian countries just to clear at the custom or to deal with different labor market. It's in many cases impossible. So I think eventually China will still be the hub and the main manufacturing center. It's the factory of the world. That status won't change. But maybe the US sanction towards China would be more focusing on the financial side rather than the manufacturing side.
I certainly agree with that. The rest of the world cannot be a substitute for China and China's achievements as a very efficient and capable manufacturing source. And when we've seen friendshoring, as Dan said, often the second-tier supplier is still China feeding into the Mexican plant or the Malaysian plant or something like that. So you still have a vulnerability to China. You've just increased the complexity and the cost of your sourcing. So why are companies doing this? Well, let me go back to the auto industry as an example. Maybe you have a production line in the United States. Maybe a particular vehicle has 2,000 parts that you assemble. Maybe 50 of them come from China. And they don't have to be anything really fancy. They could be a bumper or a luggage rack or a headlight or something. But if that flow is stopped, you have to stop the whole assembly line. You basically close down the plant. And so companies around the United States have had to do a supply chain resilience studies. This is very common in the US now. The pandemic really emphasized it, and also looking at the sanctions that have gone on with respect to Russia and looking at other disruptions. And so China has often been the center of these supply chain resilience studies because China is such a major supplier. And even though it may cost more to source someplace else, and maybe you only have a 10% chance that a certain thing would disrupt the flow, but the cost would be so great that you can't afford to do that. And so this is the struggle that companies are having and trying to figure out how to deal with this.
Okay, great. Yeah, indeed, the risk or benefit of diversification and supply chain concentration hinge very much on the trust of different parties between it will in turn go back to the issue of geopolitics. We have one more question from the audience, very interesting one. And we'd like, is it to be too nearsighted to focus only on the business opportunity when there's so many cultural opportunity, despite regardless the geopolitical conditions? And any response from either of you?
I mentioned a minute ago that I think the business relationship is important because we need to cultivate more people-to-people exchange, and business is one way for people to get together. I'm actually working with a number of different pro bono clients to try to promote people-to-people exchange. One of my clients is working to set up a youth camp, summer camp in China, where 150 American students who have been studying Chinese, middle school students, will come, and 150 Chinese students will be with them. They'll do art, they'll do different crafts, they'll do things, for about a 3-week period. But the more we can do to people, I think that's a very important investment in the future. And I completely agree with the sentiment of the author.
I definitely wish there were more cultural exchange. Definitely. I wish there were more cultural exchange and more interaction between the civil society. And the restriction, I'm afraid, is probably more from the Chinese side rather than the American side. The lack of trust on foreigners in general is quite widespread in the civil society now in China, I'm afraid. And that has a lot to do, of course, with the government, but also has a lot to do with the narrative going on in the U.S. After they label China as, say, the revisionist or adversary, and it just seems to many Chinese people that this America is no longer the America from 10 years ago. And the competition seemed to be going on. It will go on for much longer. And for Chinese students, their number one choice of studying abroad is no longer the US. After college, it seems that the European countries, especially UK, has become more favorable option. So that lack of academic collaboration will also become an issue in the future, I'm afraid.
Okay. Unfortunately, time is running out. We're up. And I wish to thank both panelists for their excellent comments and thoughts. And I will return the mic to Margaret.
Dynamic stability. I really like that slogan, and breaking down the narratives. That was all very interesting. We appreciate your expertise, all three of you, and your updates on the ground. The U.S.-China relationship keeps on evolving, and we'll keep covering it here. People-to-people exchange and cultural exchange. It is what we do at Asia Society, and we have our work cut out for us for sure. Thank you so much to Guanan, Dan, and Tim. Dan, hope you have a good flight. And for our audience, if you are not already an Asia Society member in Seattle or Northern California, please join us. You're going to get access to terrific events, some that are coming up. We have a special opportunity to attend the premiere of the film Dancing with the Dead in Seattle on April 21st. Asian Development Bank head Chantal Wang is coming to San Francisco on April 23rd. We're hosting a huge Chinese language conference in Silicon Valley on May 2nd. And our new Asia Society CEO, Dr. Kong, will also be in town in Silicon Valley on May 2nd. We're hosting a half-day India conference in Silicon Valley on June 6th, and we're hosting an India Tech event in Seattle on June 13th. Please join our events, and huge thanks to the Asia Society team, Man Wang in Seattle, Christy, Nina, Jason, Evan, and all of our interns. We're deeply grateful again to all of our speakers, and on behalf of Asia Society